Hello, Cleveland. Thank you all for coming. I'm Kirk Hallman. I'm the Executive Director of the Muskegon Museum of Art. I'll start off by saying, how many of you in the room were at one of these shows up there? How many were you at two? That's not bad. That's not bad. How many were you at a Muskegon show? Oh. How many were you at all the shows? Okay, there we go. Well, I'm an art museum director, but, before I came to the MMA 6 years ago, I spent 20 years in the music industry. And so this really hits home with me, Paul. This has been great. Just a few announcements. We have our gala coming up, sold out. I'm not going to talk about it. You snooze, you lose. But we do have $100 raffle tickets. We're going to give away $10,000 they're available in the gift store. But if you like what you saw upstairs, we do have a rock legend coming here on the Friday after the gala, June 14th. Am I right? That Friday after the gala. We have Lawrence Juber coming here. He was any Paul McCartney and Wings fans from the 1970s. Lawrence was Paul McCartney's lead guitarist. He lived with Paul and Linda for several years. What Lawrence did was, his years with Wings, he chronicled this private life of Paul and Linda for a couple of years. So you can see that in the Tuttle Gallery. So he's going to come here. He's going to do a show. He's one of the best guitar players in the world. He's won a couple of Grammys. And anytime you turn on a television show or see a movie, Lawrence has probably had a hand in composing that music. So it's going to be really exciting to have him here for a show. Tickets are available in the auditorium. So just a couple quick thank yous. Steve and Deb Olson, I don't think they came tonight, but Northern Machine Tools underwritten this exhibition. And Frank and Susan Benerick has underwritten, made it possible for Lawrence to come to the Art Museum on the 14th. So we're really happy about that. If you have a chance, we got the Bennett Prize upstairs, pretty edgy exhibition that has been cast a national net for the MMA across the country. We're really proud of that. We have Legos. It's a whole pop culture thing with the rock and roll going this summer. So I'm going to bring up Art, Mr. Rock and Roll Martin. And he's our senior curator, and he put together this show with Paul. If you see our stuff, it looks so beautiful because of Art and his staff. So I just sit and I, sign the checks in the back office. I can't claim too much credit. But I did on this one because I know music, right? So anyways, I'm going to bring up Art Martin. He'll introduce Paul, and I'm sure this is going to be a totally fascinating talk. Thank you.
I'm only cool vicariously. So Paul is going to talk about his biography, so I'm not going to steal that thunder from him. So we learned of Paul and his work through our marketing firm. Amanda Rogalski said, I have a friend who takes photos. This is the most terrifying thing you hear right after my friend makes paintings. But we did agree to see them. And they were immediately attention-grabbing, they were stunning, they were sharp, they were focused, they were composed, and they really did capture all of the energy and excitement one would imagine from these shows, one would experience at these shows. So we met Paul, we talked with him, and over the course of 6 months, roughly, we selected the images, we worked closely with them. We looked at all the samples, and it's been a wonderful experience. And so why would we do rock and roll photography? Because they're great photographs. And so for us, it was the artistry of them, that visual eye that was able to put all of this information into this single image. The technical skill, we have a lot of photography in the area, and for us it's a great opportunity to share that. And also it is a community experience. It is a shared cultural experience. People remember these shows, people go to these shows, and they become part of our shared cultural fabric. So I will talk a little bit about Paul. He began his career early. Right out of high school, he took his first photographs, did an interview with Gene Simmons of Kiss. That led to a series of photographs in national publications, in area publications. He then went on to edit GR Review, and then after a stint leaving all of that behind, has returned to the concert photography. and you see the results of that both early and now currently in his career. So please join me in welcoming Paul Jendrasiak.
Well, thank you very much for being the very first to come out here to see the opening of Lights, Camera, Rock and Roll. Really means a lot to me. And big thank you to the Muskegon Museum of Art. I can't say enough great things about them. This museum is one of the great jewels of West Michigan, so it's a very high honor, and I'm very humbled to have been selected to have the opportunity to showcase my photography here. And I'm just going to, take a little time and maybe just fill in the background of how I got into photography and talk about some of these photographs that are featured here in Lights, Camera, Rock and Roll. So when I was a teenager, I grew up in the midst of hair metal, and that was kind of my guilty pleasure. And so when I was about 13, 14 years old, I wanted to play guitar. I wanted to be like these guys. And there you go. My mom took that out in the backyard in front of the garage, and it doesn't get more hair metal than that now, does it? So I then was enamored with Music Review, which was kind of like the local Rolling Stone magazine in Grand Rapids. And so I was just a few days outside of graduating Ottawa Hills High School, and kind of realized I wasn't going to become a rock star at that point. And, well, maybe it's good to realize at 18 that it's not going to happen for you. And I thought, well, what else could I do? And I noticed KISS was going to come through town, and I called up the magazine, chatted with Bruce Madden. I know Bruce was here earlier. I don't know if he's still here with us, but told him I could get him an interview with Gene Simmons of KISS, and I didn't have any experience, didn't have any contacts, and managed 3 days later to have Gene Simmons on the phone. And if you're going to dive in at the deep end of the pool. And it was a pretty intimidating experience, as you can probably imagine if you've seen Gene on the show Family Jewels that used to be on TV. And so there's the interview tape. And then that was the first issue I was in Music Review. There's Gene. I'm the guy with the sucked-in cheeks. And so I went on to interview probably about 150, 200 folks who were coming through the West Michigan area. But because I was, going to these shows, I thought, well, it'd be kind of cool to photograph them too. And there's John Bon Jovi too. The cheeks aren't as sucked in this one. So my dad, and I'll be honest with you, when I was a kid in high school, I'd forget something and he'd come to high school and he'd be wearing a shirt like that, and it was always embarrassing. But now, as I stand up here, I'm envious of that shirt, and I wish I had that because I have a nice 70s shirt collection going on these days. But my dad, I think he wanted to be a photographer, and I told him I wanted to shoot pictures and people who were up on stage, long hair and guitars, from his time period. That was a pretty foreign thing to me, but my dad thought that was pretty cool. So he gave me a camera that my late uncle used and wanted me to have a crack at shooting pictures. And so I went out to Club Eastbrook and shot photos of Tim Allen. That was probably the first show I ever shot. Shot the Black Crowes. I didn't know at the time that they'd let me up in front of the stage, but still, nonetheless, pretty fun show to shoot. Seeing them in about 1990 was, I guess, my equivalent of seeing the Rolling Stones just after they came out. Great energy to the show, and was cool to meet them. And I kind of, at that point, went to my dad, said, you know, I want to pursue photography a little bit further. Took me out to Ritz Camera at Woodland Mall. This was a couple weeks before he passed away, and got me a proper camera, which I used to shoot all the early photos that you see from 1990 until 93. And photos that, you know, you're seeing from that time period sat in my garage for almost 20 years, and started scanning those in, and just going to kind of roll through a few of those and chat about those. Dimebag Darrell, Pantera. I'm sure there's some metal fans here, so they know Dimebag. And when I look back on some of that stuff with Pantera, it dawned on me that I was up on stage with them. And as I'm almost 50 years old, I think that that's absolutely crazy, because Pantera was intense as a band, but the audience was pretty insane. And it was kind of a war zone, and lucky to be alive. And then this calendar of, I was shooting a lot of shows early 91, and right there, 1st of November, right across the street, L.C. Walker Arena, Metallica, Rush at the Palace, Chili Peppers, which is in the show, which was along with Pearl Jam and Smashing Pumpkins, but I was keeping pretty busy. And Metallica, that's from L.C. Walker Arena. That was just before Metallica really began their huge rise to stardom with the Black Album. And that's one of the photos in the exhibition. I always thought James looked in both of those pictures like a lion with his hair, like his mane. And I was fortunate enough a few years ago to have that photo of James picked up by Ernie Ball Guitar Strings and used in their advertising, along with a photo from the same show of Kirk Hammett. And so it was kind of cool, because those, again, sat in my garage for 20-some years until I scanned those in. And Eddie Vedder, Pearl Jam, Kalamazoo State Theater, they opened up for Smashing Pumpkins and the Chili Peppers, and nobody knew who Pearl Jam was. And I still remember that night standing there in the State Theater. It was very drafty. Pearl Jam came on. It was pretty much near dark. And a week later, Pearl Jam was all over the place, and kind of the rest is history. And one of those photos from the show ended up getting used on a European bootleg. A few of those shots ran in Kerrang overseas and in Hit Parader, because those were some of the very first live shots of Pearl Jam once they started becoming a pretty big band. And Anthony Kiedis from the Chili Peppers, that was kind of their homecoming show at Kalamazoo, because Anthony is from around the area. And then Smashing Pumpkins, Billy Corgan, they were middle of the bill. And interesting story on the guitar, a couple months ago, Billy was reunited with that guitar. It was stolen out the back door of, I think it was the Fillmore in Detroit, maybe a year before. And he was just reunited with that guitar a couple months ago. And I sent him a picture of that, and he thought it was pretty cool, and he wanted to get a print of that. So he may have a print of that in his studio in Chicago. So kind of cool that that photo has a life 30 years later. Coco Taylor, Queen of the Chicago Blues. Honestly, I don't even remember photographing her, and I wish I could chalk it up to alcohol and drugs. But when I was in my 20s, I was very straight-laced, and I was probably more interested in being 40 years old than 20 years old. But grateful that I had the opportunity, and I love the emotion and expression. I'm a huge fan of the blues, and grateful for the opportunity to photograph her. Some of you maybe were at this. It was one of the big events of the early 90s in Grand Rapids. Morrissey came to Vinyl Solution, which was kind of the big Gen X record store on 28th Street. It's now a mattress store. Times change. And so I was fortunate to be out there for Morrissey, and I didn't even know who Morrissey was because I was a hair metal guy. But it was funny, when I scanned that stuff in years later, there were people in these photos that I didn't know then that I met years later, and seeing them with their young baby faces waiting to get photos and records autographed was kind of a cool thing to see. Chris Whitley, I know a lot of people may not know who Chris is, but it was a photo I wanted to have in the show. He had a pretty big song in about 92, 93 called Big Sky Country. And when I look in that, I see kind of pain and beauty. Chris unfortunately passed away in 2005, but an extraordinary musician. And it's one of my favorite photos in the show. Maynard from Tool. Maynard spent some time in Grand Rapids, went to Kendall. I just remember how intense of a show that was. And Andy O'Reilly, who's here, he and I used to be board ops at KLQ. When he was in a few days ago, we were chatting, and he was mentioning when they cleaned out a closet at KLQ, he found a tape of Maynard's when Maynard was trying to get a record deal, and kind of a cool little story, but just the intensity of Maynard. There's kind of a little bit of an ugliness, intensity to the photo, but it's just, it's rock and roll, it's the grunge, it's the grit. Shannon Hoon from Blind Melon, Club Eastbrook, just laying on the stage there. That was just after No Rain came out. I think it was one of those 94-cent KLQ shows at the time, but I think that really captures the mood and emotion of Shannon. And then after 93, I decided to kind of hang up my camera. I cut my hair, and got into the software business, internet business for a while, and was in Wired magazine. And it wasn't until 2010 that I decided to pick up a camera again. A good friend of mine who's here, Josh, had a website called grnow.com. And I said, I'm interested in taking pictures again. And I'd become enamored with another photographer back from the 60s, Jim Marshall. He was kind of the grandfather of music photography. And so I wanted to start shooting shows again. Josh was like, well, cool, do it. And so the first big show I shot was Elton John, Van Andel Arena, a couple shots of him. And so I've been shooting again ever since. And Taylor Swift was another one of the first shows, and kind of like the way that the lighting frames her and in her guitar, and that was from Van Andel Arena. Scott Weiland, Stone Temple Pilots. I'd interviewed Scott back when they became a pretty big deal in the mid-90s, and I always thought he was one of the great rock frontmen. Sad that he's passed on. But just an incredible stage presence. I mean, you can feel the intensity in the photo. Alice Cooper from Rock the Rapids. I mean, great Michigan artist, and always been a fan. And just the theater of his performances. Slash, always been a huge Guns N' Roses fan, so it was pretty neat being only a few feet from him. It's probably one of my favorite songs, Night Train, so he's in the middle of the solo, but just the intensity of that. Flea from the Chili Peppers, I just happened to catch that right before the third song ended. Just put my camera up and just happened to catch him midair, last shot of the song. Snoop Dogg at the intersection, he was supposed to go on about 9 o'clock. He went on at midnight. It's Snoop Dogg. And the haze that you're seeing, well, you can do the math. But I love the reflection of the audience in his glasses. Kid Rock, Airborne, Van Andel Arena, he's always an incredible performer. Willie Nelson, State Theater. Willie was probably about 80 there, and just the genuine nature of Willie, is incredible. Some of these folks who've been touring for years and years, they're just going through the motion. They're picking up a paycheck. But, Willie's the real deal. And he loves what he does. Rob Zombie, I was talking with quite a few people in the gallery about Rob. Rob is a challenge to photograph because he's always moving from one end of the stage to the other, and he's got the dreadlocks. And whoever does his lighting, I think that they double as doing the lighting in hell. But kudos to them. It's Rob Zombie, and he's one of the most awesome performers in my book. Steven Tyler, Aerosmith. I've been an Aerosmith fan since I discovered their greatest hits in my brother's tape case when I was about 13 years old and stole the cassette. And Steven Tyler, those guys still have an incredible energy, and they're almost in their 70s. Marilyn Manson. Usually when you shoot a show, you get about 3 songs to shoot. Marilyn gave you 1 song, and he came out in the midst of just a bunch of white smoke. So you're standing there and you're thinking, oh man, I'm screwed. And I managed to get a nice collection of shots, but this was my favorite of him. It's just Marilyn Manson being Marilyn Manson. I love the way the light catches his eyebrow. It has a grotesqueness about it, which would probably be a compliment to Marilyn. But there's also an interesting beauty to it, and I love the color, and I love the way that they chose to lay it out in the gallery, where you have Gene Simmons and you have Marilyn, the red and the green. It plays off each other incredibly well. And there's Gene. And Gene, as I mentioned, was the first guy I interviewed, and Kiss is probably the most photo-ready band that you're ever going to photograph. It's hard to take a bad shot of them. They're always so well lit. I didn't have a chance to shoot them when they were in Grand Rapids the other month, but the lighting scheme was very different. It looked a lot darker, but I love the greens and I love the intensity of Gene there. And obviously, we've got a tongue thing going on. Steve Vai, when I was a kid, one of the reasons I picked up guitar was Steve Vai. And Steve was kind enough to let me shoot his whole set. And one of my all-time favorite shots, it's just, Steve is an incredible performer, showman. So I sent him the shot, let him know that he was in the exhibition. He thought it was great, and he said it was tasty too. So Paul McCartney, as Kirk mentioned, Lawrence Juber's coming. Paul was probably the biggest show at Van Andel Arena. That's him just as he came out on stage. And just like Willie Nelson, he's one of those performers, he's doing it to this day because he loves it. It's in his blood, and it was a great opportunity to be able to shoot Paul. Flaming Lips at the 20 Monroe, great show. Wayne coming out in the ball with the audience and all that. Usually, as you'll notice with my shots, I'm always going for something close up and personal, but I like the energy of this, the wideness of the shot. Gary Clark Jr., huge fan of the blues. Gary's been taking off a lot in the last few years, and this is probably one of my all-time favorite shots. I like the mood of it. I like the lighting. Sometimes it's just, right moment, right time, and you capture everything. And, you can feel his presence, and even though you're not hearing the music, you can feel his music. Elton John, that was a couple months ago on the Farewell Yellow Brick Road tour. Always been a huge fan of Elton. My sister gave me his greatest hits album when I was about 9 years old. That old Elton John music really holds a special place for me. And then, so Elton looks very happy there. The photographers were up there. I think, Jeff, were you at that show? You weren't. Oh, okay. So once we were done shooting, Elton John giving us the goodbye. Thanks to my friend Tony for making a gif of that. And thank you to everybody. And I'd like to, take some questions if anybody wanted to talk about photography or anything that I could answer for them.
Darrell, you mentioned the passion in some of these artists, which it's apparent in pictures and giving a lot of some tremendous content. Who are some bands now that you say you get the opportunity to see live?
Well, there was a band called Royal Blood. They're not a super well-known band, but they opened up for Queens of the Stone Age about a year ago at 20 Monroe. And they just blew me away. It was just a bass player and a drummer, and the stuff that this guy was pulling out of his bass was pretty amazing. And they would be a band that I definitely would recommend seeing. I know a lot of people talk about a new artist by the name of Billie English. Dave Grohl speaks highly of her. That's somebody that I'd be interested in photographing in the future.
Yeah, you were saying sometimes you get 1, maybe 3 songs.
Yeah.
Have you ever been up there and then, you're doing a job, but have you ever been like all of a sudden just kind of caught up in the moment? And how do you stay focused on your job and you see some of these incredible performances?
Well, you can get caught up in the moment in a number of ways. If you really like the band, you kind of get sucked into the music and you forget that you're supposed to be shooting pictures. And sometimes, the lighting can be a challenge. A lot of these newer bands, they're backlighting stuff, and they're not, spotlighting stuff as, a lot of these performers used to, like Kiss, Gene Simmons, spotlights on him, but shooting MGMT the other night, and it was just, it was dark. So sometimes you just, you want to throw your hands in the air, but you just got to kind of take a moment and refocus and say, I got to shoot this a little bit differently, and I got to approach this a little bit differently. But one of the other challenges can be if you're in the pit between the audience and the stage. And in the early 90s, you'd be at these metal shows and people are flying over the barricades, so you got to keep an eye out behind you. And actually at one show, somebody threw up like an M80 or something like that blew up between right in the pit. And I was keeping an eye out for pyros at the time, but sadly somebody lost an eye, actually. They caught the kid, but it's like, I don't know why you would go to a show to do that, to be a jerk, but you do have to kind of be paying attention to what's going on in your environment. But first and foremost, you need to make sure that you're not obstructing the view of the audience, because those people paid very good money to be there at the show, and you want to be absolutely 100% courteous to them. Mark? Oh, Randy. Well, Kiss for sure. I mean, Kiss is a great marketing piece at the end of the day, and there's a real genius in that. I mean, whether you love Kiss or hate Kiss, I mean, you've got to respect them. I mean, here they are, 40, 50 years later. I mean, obviously they're doing something right, but they're also very good to the fans, but they know how to, create those photo ops, and, I think a lot of other bands definitely learn from them.
Two questions.
Sure.
One is, in your equipment, are you still using the Nikon? Have you graduated to something else? Do you mix it up? And secondly, your music appreciation seems to be broad. Taylor Swift, heavy metal, Willie Nelson, blues. So I would love to hear what might be a preference for you there, if you can even do that.
Sure. Well, these days I shoot Canon. It just happened to be what I felt most comfortable with when I got back into doing photography. So it's nothing against Nikon. I mean, I know some people are, I only use Nikon, I only use Canon. I mean, whatever you connect with is what you should use. I mean, it's like, well, some people have an iPhone, some people have an Android, whatever works for you. As far as music tastes go, I was born of hair metal, I guess. That's still a guilty pleasure, and we should never be ashamed of our guilty pleasures. Well, it's comfort food. But I really love the blues. Gary Clark Jr. was incredible to photograph, and the opportunity to be mere feet from some of these people is just, is pretty cool. But Slash is great, because I've always been a huge fan of Guns N' Roses. But my taste in music is eclectic, but what I will tell you is stuff that I shot in the film days is a lot of stuff that I didn't care for those bands. I wasn't a fan of Pearl Jam or Smashing Pumpkins. I am now, but back then it was this transition. Probably about a week in 1991, hair metal was king, and then you had grunge, and the landscape of that changed, and then you had the alternative music coming out after that. So I'm glad that I shot those bands, even though I wasn't like a big fan. So you shouldn't always be like, I'm going to only shoot what I like. You should be open to shooting other stuff, for sure.
I have a question. Sure. Did you just decide I'm going to go to that club, whatever, in Grand Rapids, and just walk in and say I'm a photographer? How did you do that?
Well, you need to be credentialed. So you would need to be working with a media outlet. But, I was fortunate enough to be with a magazine, so I was able to do that. And, they, believed in me enough to send me out to there to shoot photos early on, but I was able to then create pictures that were compelling pictures. Yeah, film, you're confined to 24 to 36 exposures, so you're going to be much more mindful of what you're shooting. And with digital, you know, you could fill up hundreds of pictures at a show, but you also have that instant gratification. You know that you got the shot. With film, you know, you're going to have to wait and see what you got back. But there's also other things, you know, with film, you know, you do the processing. That's not as complicated, but with digital, you know, you're going to spend a lot of time editing those pictures at some level to get them to communicate what you want them to communicate. But it was very much a night and day experience from what I shot from the early 90s and then started shooting in 2010.
I think the Chris Whitley photograph really captured him wonderfully in his early career.
Thank you.
And I wondered if you ever got to photograph him again.
I didn't. That was the only time. I mean, I wish I had, but I'm glad that I had the opportunity to photograph him once. And he has an incredible fan base to this day, a very loyal fan base. I mean, they love him. I mean, he was an incredibly talented musician. It's sad that he left us too soon, but sometimes that's, you know, what happens in, you know, in any type of creative pursuit, sadly. But he left a great body of work, and I mean, I think he can be proud of that.
Do you have to get the singer's permission to use their picture, like that great one of Gene Simmons? Do you have to ask them if you can use it?
Well, there's a couple things. I mean, you're getting permission from a publicist to be able to photograph them. But in addition to that, some artists will have you sign a release, and that may stipulate a number of things, that you can only use it for one usage, or you can, you know, do this or do that with it, but you can be kind of confined with those. So there are times where I will just simply pass on shooting a show if I feel that the release is too confining. But, I mean, in this day and age that we live in, I think it's very difficult for one to 100% control one's image. I mean, the internet was such a big game changer with that. Lori?
With that being said, I wonder, there's a couple things. How often is it where you just feel frustrated that you can't get the credentials, and then you just, because that's so easy for you to, because we are so credentialed, but then there's a show that you really want, but you can't get it. And then if the writers, the stipulations are too tight, where they say you can only shoot this side of the face, and you're.
It depends. I mean, if it's an artist that I really like, yeah, I mean, that can be a little bit of a downer. But sometimes it's just like, oh, well, okay. But it's not necessarily about you. There's a lot of artists who won't allow anybody to photograph them. On the calendar I had up from the early 90s, Bob Dylan was on there for the Fox Theater, and I don't think Bob Dylan allows anybody to photograph him. So, I mean, that's just going to be the way it is, and it is what it is, but that's okay. But then you look back and you can say, well, I was fortunate enough to photograph somebody in the 90s early on, but maybe they don't allow people to photograph them now, so, you know, there's that too, you know, so.
Well, your work is just wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
I may have missed it, but when you said that you, after 20 years, you went into your garage and dug this out,
Mm-hmm.
what was the impetus for that?
Well, I started taking photos again in 2010, and then in 2012 I got a scanner, and I had started working with another photographer in Los Angeles who had begun selling some of my stuff, and he said, well, that old stuff you have, that's where the money is. So I bought a scanner. And I think that, a lot of the stuff that I shot in the early 90s is going to become back in vogue again because you have Gen X coming of age. They're hitting their 50s. They're becoming empty nesters. And I think that they want to bask in this comfort food of what they enjoyed in their late teen years and in their 20s. So they're going to be all about Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Smashing Pumpkins in those bands again. And I mean, we're 30 years out from, in 2021, from Nirvana, Nevermind, and all the Pearl Jam stuff and grunge stuff. Jennifer.
So you talked about how in some instances you would actually contact a musician and say, hey, I took this photograph of you, blah, blah, blah. Can you share a story of when a musician somehow came across your picture and contacted you directly and said, I want that copy?
Well, Billy Corgan had mentioned that he wanted a copy of that because he was just reunited with his guitar, so that's definitely one that comes to mind, and so that was kind of cool because that like spanned 30 years ago. So you never know where something that you took 30 years ago is going to end up. Like those Metallica photos, I never would have thought that those would end up in guitar string advertising. So everybody should go into the garage and see what they've got. Jason.
I think you got to follow. You got explain how that goes. Give us some color to it. Does Billy Corgan ring up the phone and say, "Hi, my name's Billy Corgan. I play in a band called Smashing Pumpkins, and I came across." I mean, how does that go? You can't just say.
Well, Jason, you and I know that nobody talks on phones anymore. A fax. Yes. A fax to the UPS store. It was we were chatting over Instagram, which is the mode of communication these days. For now, I mean, a year from now, who knows? I mean, we'll all. Oh, he liked the photo and he wanted a print of it, and I also happened to. Maybe you'll know who this is. He also likes Yngwie Malmsteen, who is this neoclassical guitar player. So I sent him a couple of pictures of Yngwie as well, but never in a million years would I have guessed that he liked Yngwie Malmsteen, but there you go.
I'll go with another one.
Sure.
So your persona today is so different from the long-haired, want to be a rock star, and the people you're around for the most part. Have you always been this way, or?
Is that a good thing? Well, I think my foundation has always been the same. The hair thing I can't 100% help. Although it's moved. It's the mailing address has changed. But I mean, my heart and soul are the same with that. I think as we get older, we return to things which gave us joy. Maybe when you were in your early 20s, as you approach your 40s, you want to get back involved in those. So photography was one of those things that I was very passionate about, and I thought I was pretty good at it. And I was like, well, I want to do this again. And I also got back into the interviewing thing because I did a radio show for a while, and I always enjoy talking to people and find out what makes them tick. And so whether I have long flammable hair or this prickly patch on the top of my head. I'm the same guy as I was when I was 18 years old at the end of the day, except I've had a pain in my neck from sleeping on a bad pillow, but otherwise, so far, so good. Any other questions?
Right now, who would you shoot? Your favorite?
Who would I like to shoot?
Right now.
Well, I would like to shoot the Foo Fighters. I dig them. But, and I know this wasn't your question, kind of, but I wish I shot Nirvana, and I don't know why I didn't shoot Nirvana, because I was shooting at the time, but I do regret missing out on shooting Nirvana. But, it just, I love shooting just such an eclectic mix of musicians, and they all have something different to offer. And at some level, I think it's an emotional transaction where, they're creating music and you're capturing something, a brief moment in time. So it's fun to be able to have the opportunity to do that. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much. It means a lot to me that you all came out this evening, and a big thanks to the Muskegon Museum of Art. Extraordinary working with them. I can't say enough great stuff about them, and thank you so much.